Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us yet again. I suspect it won't be the last COVID conversation we have this year. And Lewis, thanks for joining me. You're actually in the office today.
I am. I've got a better setup here than at home with toddlers and crying children. So presenting from the office, and somewhere will be more often from what I hear in the coming weeks as the health order lifts.
We should first of all say, don't panic. We are going to go and get a haircut next week. Is that right?
Well, yet to be confirmed, Nigel. Yet to be confirmed. So look, we've got a lot to get through today. When we structured this, we originally thought we would concentrate on New South Wales, probably because New South Wales, in terms of this kind of roadmap out, is the most advanced of the states who've had real COVID challenges in the most recent months. It would be remiss of us, though, if we didn't talk a little bit quickly about the Victorian directions around mandatory vaccinations. We're going to kick off there. We'll get into the return roadmap that is New South Wales, although our new Premier has already made some changes to it this morning, which we'll try and get to as well. Want to then talk a little bit through the whole question about return to work, and at the back end of the conversation, we're going to get onto this broader issue that we're being hit with almost on a daily basis of, do I mandate vaccinations or not for customers? Do I mandate vaccinations or not for my employees, irrespective of what's going on with the government? And we'll get into that at the back end. And as always, we'll take questions at the end. We'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, at the end. And as we see questions pop up, we'll try and answer them on the run. And sometimes we might not actually read them out, but we'll be aware of them. We'll try and make sure they fit in. So let's just kick off. I thought it might be good to start with Victorian. Lou, I might grab Victoria if you don't mind. Please.
Very, very interestingly, and I think most of our Victorian clients, members of relevant associations in Victoria who are watching today, they'll be aware that the Victorian government has issued a new public health direction. That's the mandatory vaccination direction number 5. I'm not going to go into this in great detail other than to say some sort of highlight issues. What it effectively requires is that certain employers must now take reasonable steps to ensure that their workers who are unvaccinated do not enter or remain on the employer's premises after a particular date, which I'll come to in a moment. It's not that the government has said certain people must be vaccinated. It's that the government have said certain people working in certain industries can't go to work, as it were, can't enter the workplace unless they are vaccinated. What are those industries? Those industries are residential aged care facilities, construction sites, healthcare facilities, and education facilities. If you've got any anxiety as to whether or not you're captured by that, please let us know. There's some very broad definitions for those 4 industries. Essentially what it means is, from a particular date, which I'll come to, the employer has a number of obligations. Obligation number 1 is the employer must collect, record and hold vaccination information about their employees, whether or not they're fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated or not. And the next obligation is that the employer obviously can't allow people to attend for work and enter the premises unless they are fully vaccinated. 2 important things to understand about that. Number 1 is that there's an obligation to inform your employees of all of that. There is a bit of a get out of jail free card, and that is if your employees are not fully vaccinated, between certain dates, as long as they've booked in to get their first dose, they're allowed to come to work as normal, even though they're not fully vaccinated. I'll go through that. There are certain parcels of work which are exempt from all of this, and we'll call that emergency work. And again, if you've got a plumber coming into your childcare centre for a broken pipe, that would be a good example of somebody who's probably not going to be covered by this. And of course, as historically been the case, if you've got a medical exemption, contradiction, you don't actually have to have a vaccination status that's fully vaccinated. The dates are really confusing. I apologise for that. Depending on which sector you're in, you've got different dates. If you look at the right-hand side, you'll see this thing called the relevant date. that is the date for that particular form of facility where people have to be fully vaccinated to attend work and remain on the site. Let's just take education for an example. Pretend you're running a childcare centre. So by the 18th of October, your workers, if they're going to come onto the site and remain there, have to be fully vaccinated. If they're not fully vaccinated at that date, as long as they have booked in to get their first dose between the 18th of October and that date that says first dose date, the 25th of October, you can allow them to come to work after the 18th of October, even though they're not fully vaccinated. So essentially, it's from those relevant dates, must be fully vaccinated. You've got to be collecting relevant information about vaccination status. But there is a little bit of wriggle room between what's called the relevant date and the first dose date, as long as your employees actually booked in to get their first dose and can validate that and you hold that record. So that's what's going on in Victoria. Obviously, they're in all sorts of pain at the moment, very similar to New South Wales recently, and they're going down the path of making sure certain people can't attend the workplace unless they have fully vaccinated status, subject to some small exemptions. That's what's going on in Victoria. Let's come to New South Wales. Said Dominic Perrottet made a few changes, but essentially we've got a three-phase process in terms of coming out of where we've been. The big kick-off point was 70% full vaccination. We hit that yesterday, Lou, did we?
Yes, yep.
Yesterday, so hurrah, well done.
Yes, takes effect on Monday, the new requirements, and I'm happy to go through this. If you look at stages 1 and 2, what we're talking about here is the initial stepping out of the current lockdown rules. You'll see under both stages 1 and 2, and you'll see this quite consistently, a lot of the rules for 70% vax are quite similar to 80%. For both those stages, you now still must allow staff to continue to work from home if it is reasonably practical to do so. So what that means is if the staff wish to work from home and can do so, they are entitled to remain at home, but that does not prohibit staff from coming in. Staff can now come in to the workplace subject to a couple of additional requirements. One, that should not be the case for persons who are not fully vaccinated. If they are not fully vaccinated, they must still remain at home unless they cannot perform their role in a reasonably practical manner from home. So for people who want to stay from home, they can, but if they are vaccinated, if they're not fully vaccinated, then they must not really be attending the workplace unless they cannot do their job from home. We've also got some mask requirements. The roadmap up until today was that you would still need masks for all staff and customers in indoor settings, but that has been revised this morning, and that mask requirement will now cease from the 80% vaccination date. So that's probably a couple of weeks' time. And COVID safe check-ins are still required. So that's broadly where we're sitting for stages 1 and 2.
So Lou, essentially up until that stage 3, only vaccinated people in the workplace.
That's right, unless they can't reasonably practically do their job from home. There is an ability for unvaccinated people to come to work from Monday if they can't do their job from home, though, which is a big, big change for those people, for instance, in affected LGAs. This prohibition on leaving their LGA has fallen out of the health orders. So you will likely see some people returning to workplaces, factories, warehousing, those types of industries who now can be vaccinated workplace by reference to the public health orders at least. If we now come to stage 3, this is where we really lift off. All rules relating to working from home cease. So effectively, working from home moves back to the world we were in pre-COVID, which is that it is really a matter for employers and employees to discuss and agree upon working from home arrangements, and will be subject to your usual contractual arrangements, as well as the ability to request flexible working arrangements under the Fair Work Act. The rules requiring a level of vaccination to present to work will cease, and there will no longer be public health orders mandating a level of vaccination. Mask rules will cease for most workplaces, but for a few. And you'll see there on the slide, there's a few industries where there will still be mask requirements, including front of house hospitality staff. And really interestingly, and I don't know if this is going to change, but under the current roadmap, the COVID-safe check-in requirements are no longer on the roadmap for stage 3. Now, I'd assume that they might stick around for a little while, but it appears that, at least on the current drafting of the roadmap, that will cease as well.
And it's interesting you say that, because I've been looking for that and I can't find it anywhere. So it does seem that on the 1st of December, assuming that date stays, by the way, because the way things are moving, it might get moved forward, it might be that date, who knows. But let's assume it is the 1st of December. Basically, it's sort of open season is the best way to describe it, Lewis. Would that be the right way to put it?
Yeah, and I think feeding on that, Nigel, and without wanting to sound too glib about it or to take it too lightly, the reality is COVID will be circulating quite a lot. So this notion that contact tracers are going to follow up every single premises where someone has visited with a case, it's probably not going to happen, which is why the requirement for the check-ins might be ceasing. What does exist, and we don't have on the slides though, is there will be a requirement to notify New South Wales Health where a certain prescribed number of cases have come to the workplace which are positive. I think it's 3 cases within a particular period. So there will be a positive obligation on employers to notify or occupiers of premises, but not just one COVID case. It's more where there's a higher trend. And again, I think that's because there's going to be an acceptance. There's going to be a level of transmission and circulation in the community, which is something we're no doubt going to come to, Nigel, in a more animated fashion later on when we talk about vaccinations.
Well, we should acknowledge that we spent an hour arguing this morning, so that's fine. We might move on. Public health measures business.
Yeah, sorry. This and
touched on some of this, but you might just go again, Blue.
Yeah. I didn't realise we'd been diligent enough to put it on the slide. So there's the 3 or more employees required. If you've got 3 or more employees test positive in the 7-day period, that's the requirement I was talking about. You have to notify New South Wales Health. There are still, in stages 1 and 2, some quite significant vaccination mandates on occupiers of premises. And that is for certain industries, you cannot let people onto your site. I'm actually going to rephrase that. It's not that you cannot let them onto your site. You must take reasonable measures to ensure that persons do not enter the site in these industries. And that is generally retail, except for critical retail. And I'll come back to that. Premises where a significant event is being held, like weddings and funerals, recreation facilities, public swimming pools. The big exception is critical retail. So think about supermarkets, even kiosks that sell takeaway food and drinks are called by that. But in these other business areas that we've got listed on the slide, you must be taking reasonable steps to ensure unvaccinated people don't enter. And that includes your staff. So if you think back to the earlier slide where we talked about people having a right to present for work, for instance, if they're unvaccinated, if it's not reasonably practical to work from home, that doesn't work in these industries. Because in these industries, the occupier of the premises needs to ensure that people aren't coming on who are unvaccinated only in these industries. So there is a higher threshold there. And if you are in retail, if you are in hospitality, if you're holding events, recreation facilities, you do still have quite a level of rigor you need to be applying until we get to stage 3.
And these propositions, Lewis, you're saying stage 1 and stage 2. Can we come back to this question about taking reasonable steps, if we can? I'm assuming, because we're getting a lot of questions on what reasonable steps are, you'd certainly want to be asking people to show what's hopefully on your mobile phone, whether or not you've got your certificate.
Yeah, I would have thought asking someone before entering a premises is kind of what a court would expect at that base level, a step that is reasonably practicable to take. Asking for proof might be the next step, but certainly asking is the absolute starting point. We all know what happens in pubs for years when it comes to ID. Most businesses selling alcohol don't seem to have an issue checking for identification. You'd envisage a pretty similar process applying in relation to vaccination status in most businesses, and that being something that's reasonably able to be done.
And as you say, that's stage 1 and 2 for this particular class of business, and that evaporates come stage 3.
Yes. And I think we do need to be careful with certain really small businesses. It might be, for some, the posting of very large signs and informing people that they're not
only enter if. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you might not have the staffing to put someone at the door, and it might not be reasonable to go and hire a security guard. It's going to depend on your size and the types of measures that would be practicable for a very small business that's struggling to get back on their feet after a particularly long lockdown. Having a staff member paid to stand at the door is probably not practicable, but then you'd need to look at other things. Do you have signs up? Do you ask them when they're at the register? They're the kind of things you need to be thinking about.
Which is very similar to what everybody's done for QR codes for the last 4 months anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you must do the QR code when you come in, and you go to the counter for the coffee shop and they say, "Can I just check it, please?" You show it to them, and off we go.
Well, yes, but you go to a large chain supermarket or a big department store, and they've probably got someone checking that you're checking in at the front door
right.
because of the size of the enterprise.
Okay.
So that probably covers the roadmap out. The next thing, Nigel, that I thought would be helpful for employers, and it really feeds into what we're just talking about, is, well, how do you understand someone's vaccination status during these stage 1 and 2 phases? And there's really a very important thing people need to recognise, and that is the application of the Privacy Act in some circumstances. If you are taking a record, effectively, if you're going to collect information and record it down in a document or in a register, the moment you record that information, which is personal information about a person, you are moving into a world that is heavily regulated by the Privacy Act. You need to comply with...
Lou, before we jump, the threshold for the Privacy Act?
The threshold is for businesses that have a turnover of over $3 million. That they're the types of businesses we'll be talking about have the possibility of being covered. If you're under $3 million, you're quite right, Nigel, they won't be covered under any circumstance. But if you've got more than $3 million in turnover, the moment you start to record any of this personal information in any capacity, you've got a whole heap of Australian privacy principles to comply with about why you're collecting. You've got to tell people the purpose, where the information's going. You've got to notify them of your privacy policy. You do not need to comply with those requirements if all you are doing is citing their personal information. So much like collecting ID, you instead of collecting it, actually, as long as you just cite that they are over the age of 18, you can let them onto the premises and the privacy principles won't apply. So that's something businesses really need to be conscious of, particularly with allowing customers onto site. With staff, some businesses I know we're talking to want to keep a register. That's fine. You just need to ensure that you're complying with the Australian privacy principles if you're going to do that and if you meet that turnover threshold.
So in simple terms, if I'm doing $3 million of turnover a year or more, this applies to me. I can no longer say I'm relying on the public health orders or the health directions if I'm in another state. And citing, requesting, looking, fine. But the minute I create a document and hold a record and maintain that record, Privacy Act obligations come in. And I think I'd probably say to most people, I think we set most of the Privacy Act obligations out in our vaccination guide, Lewis, didn't we? A couple of weeks ago.
Section 5 of our vaccination guide, I believe.
So probably a great place to start. Grab a copy of that. That'll get you rolling in terms of what you need to do if these obligations do apply to you. And after that, if you need to go a little bit further, give us a call and we'll talk about that. But yeah, really important because at the moment we've been relying largely on these health directions for all of this. Once that falls away, Privacy Act concerns come into play and people need to be mindful that they're there. Not a lot of commentary out there about the Privacy Act when we come to some of these things at the moment. Lou, do you want to have a chat about this?
Yes. I think just the question mark of how you actually find out about someone's vaccination status. We've talked about taking reasonable steps. One of the things is people don't necessarily, and Nigel just referenced this, certainly in New South Wales, they're not required to inform you of their status. In Vic, we've still got in some industries that the obligation to disclose these matters to your employer. In New South Wales, that is no longer applicable from Monday. And so what we're looking at is a scenario where someone can say, well, I don't want to tell you my vaccination status. Well, you've really got two different business considerations there. If you're a business, you might decide, well, if I can't be safe, someone unvaccinated doesn't enter and I don't know their status. And I think with employers, depending on what you're doing in your business, you should not be assuming people are vaccinated unless you have gotten that indication. And so if someone is refusing to tell you, that's fine. They might do so, but then you should really assume that they are unvaccinated for the purposes of your policies going forward. And we'll talk about what you might do with unvaccinated people in the animated discussion to follow. But really, all we're talking about doing, particularly in New South Wales, is asking. The ability to compel is not really there.
Yeah, it's how you respond to that if they decline to tell you. Let's just move on then. So I want people thinking, we're now talking about returning back into the workplace. That's going to trigger the same types of considerations we spoke to most people about a year ago when we've got people coming back. We're less interested now in things like public health orders. We're more interested again in our general safety obligations in relation to ensuring we have a safe workplace. So let's just focus on those for a little while, because I don't want people to think that they don't have to be thinking about these as they bring people back into the workplace. So a classic list of the things we would tell most people to be considering about as people return, be they voluntarily returning as of Monday, or be they returning in a more formal sense from the 1st of December onwards. And typically the list that we probably put up a year ago, probably I would say, Lou, and I might pull one or two out and then I might see what you have to add to it. But I think the one that we're talking to most people about at the moment, it's more not really about the legal side of it, it's more around the psychology for people, is this issue about public transport. Most people at the moment, and I think this will be the case over the next 2 or 3 weeks, are still going to be very reticent about getting on public transport, and I suspect it might be the case for the weeks to come. And I think most employers are going to have to be working with their employees carefully around that, particularly if people haven't been sitting on a bus for an hour a day or something like that. So I think it'll be the anxiety about exposure in the broader community. It might also be just the general desire not to be sitting on a bus or a train for an hour and a half. But are there any ones particularly there you want to comment on?
I think the employee sense of safety is an interesting one. And we talk about this a little bit later on, but you're going to have some employees that are really going to be quite anxious about coming back. And the big category of them are employees with children under the age of 12.
Under the age of 12.
You need to bear in mind that when we're all saying, we're letting COVID circulate, people can choose to get vaccinated, that choice is not available to everyone. It's only available to people over 12 right now. And so they're going to be parents who are somewhat anxious about potentially not being severely infected themselves, but bring that home to those that are most precious to them and those that are quite vulnerable. And so they are probably going to be, some of them, a little bit hesitant and reluctant. And so you're going to be needing to communicate to your employees, this is what I'm doing as the owner of your business, or as the person in charge of HR or safety, or as the director. I'm going to do these things to keep you and your family safe. And I think never more has this been front and center for businesses, that there's a real duty of care on you as a business owner or HR manager to actually ensure that you've got a workplace where, yes, we may have COVID instances come, but you're doing what's reasonably possible to minimize the risk of transmission, and you're communicating to staff what you're doing so they have a sense that it's okay to come back. Otherwise, what you're going to have is some staff self-selecting out, and that might then start to present in other forms that become, you get interpersonal relationship issues, you get managers frustrated, people aren't coming in. You can try and head some of this off at the beginning by giving employees a better sense of safety, by having a very clear map of what you're doing to try to minimize transmission.
And I think that's a nice segue, because I just want people to be very mindful of the general safety obligations that they hold, because they're more moving back front and centre as of Monday, and they're definitely moving back front and centre as of the 1st of December. And I think it might just be useful just to kind of refresh people's memories a little bit. There's obviously, as the employer, you've got that primary duty that the work health and safety laws place on you, and it's this notion of making sure you have a safe workplace, and you've got to do everything that is reasonably practicable to ensure that the workplace is safe, not only for your employees but contractors, visitors, anybody who's entering that workplace. So that notion of reasonable practicability is going to come back into people's minds. I suspect it might enter the debate, Lewis, around mandatory vaccinations, I'll jump into shortly, which will be an interesting debate. But as we've said, I think we talked about this again about a year ago when we were sort of back here again a year ago. Reasonable practicability is around sort of this holistic understanding of sort of risk, how to mitigate risk. Lou, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's really assessing the likelihood of things happening, potential degree of harm, etc., against the practical availability, the cost, the ability to implement whatever the particular control is. So your starting point is you need to ensure health and safety, but then we actually look at what are the control measures and are they practicable to get to that level of satisfaction that you've ensured health and safety. And, you know, in all cases, you won't be able to do everything all the time to ensure someone's health and safety, and that's why it's moderated somewhat. And I'll just add that we've got the New South Wales Act provisions up here, but this is all from model legislation
yeah,
across the country.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand this. These issues might become more live. I mean, for instance, let's say we ran a factory, and after the 1st of December we had 1, 2, 3, 4 infections in the factory. There might be a need to, in an ongoing sense, review the risk that's being presented in the factory and make sure you're applying different approaches depending on how that risk is amplifying or not. So this is going to be a moving feast evaluation.
And I think so. And I think the one thing, we'll come to this, but what you do need to bear in mind is whilst most businesses might not have thought a lot about the common cold or the flu or things like that, I don't think it's acceptable for a business to do nothing. I mean, COVID-19 has a mortality rate of 2.7% for positive cases. Now, that's quite high. And so when you consider that that's our current mortality rate, yes, as we get more vaccinated, hopefully that goes down, you should be taking some steps, even if it is a flu-like virus that, you know, businesses might not have done much for in the past. If you do nothing, you probably are going to be in breach of the WHS laws, and that's what the Victorian Department of Health is finding out right now, as it's currently subject to a prosecution by the Safe Work regulator in Victoria for itself not taking appropriate measures during the hotel quarantines of last year.
And as I think most of our people will know, there's a variety of obligations on people running businesses. To please don't take what Lewis has just said lightly. There's an obligation to turn one's mind to these matters, to make sure one is responding if you are actually senior executives, office holders in various businesses. And as we've said, I think on numerous occasions before, it's pretty stiff if you do get caught up in the work health and safety prosecution world, Lewis. You can find yourself very quickly either at a corporate level or at an individual level subject of prosecution and fine. So please, I think the takeaway here is, as people are coming back to work, please start to cast your work health and safety mind on what it is you're doing as you bring them back into the workplace, rather than just glibly say, thankfully that's all over and here we go again. I think you need to have some level of regard, turning that work health and safety lens to how you bring people back and how you consider the challenges of people re-entering into the workplace, the office, the factory, or whatever.
And if what Nigel said hasn't convinced you, that slide was just up there to scare you instead.
Oh, that probably was as well. And, you know, we've talked before about mitigation measures. I think people still need to have in mind Public health orders require this until the 1st of December. It becomes very unclear after the 1st of December. I still want people to have in mind most of the sort of administrative safeguards even after 1st of December, social distancing, hand sanitizer. It might well be in certain places you actually want to institute some mask wearing anyway. So don't just assume because the public health orders fall away, some of those things might not be reasonable and appropriate risk mitigation measures for your business. And of course, you might still wanting to be asking people about proof of vaccination and the like as we get closer. And all the way through that, of course, general obligation, I would ask everybody to constantly be mindful that we should be consulting, we should be engaging with our employees around these issues. Lewis, anything to add?
I just wanted to raise a couple of points, Nigel, and I might pull us back to just those other measures, because I just wanted to say two particular things. When you look at these measures, and this is going to become relevant to when we talk about vaccinations later, some of these measures are really quite helpful and some might not be. Take social distancing. This is what has been the workhorse, to quote Scott Morrison, of the actual mitigation measures since last year. Distancing in terms of quarantines of borders, distancing in terms of keeping people away from each other with lockdown mandates, distancing of 1.5 metres in retail and in the office. This remains the workhorse. And so in many businesses, this is something that is proven and that has been really put at the top of the pecking order by the WHO, by the regulatory public health authorities in each jurisdiction as being very effective. We can't forget that this virus generally spreads by way of droplets and that might be in the air or physical contact. If you keep people apart, you're going to minimize that level of transmission. And so distancing should be a key element of any safety regime moving forward. I'd say the opposite about PPE. I think community experience has demonstrated that actually policing and ensuring proper mask wearing for long periods of time is very difficult. The whole problem with the construction site protests a couple of weeks ago was Dan Andrews had worked out that all the construction workers were wearing masks around their chin, which is not the place where the mask's meant to go. But, you know, as someone who's had to work from the office environment on occasion with a mask, as someone who's worn masks in retail environments, I know, like all of you do, that it's pretty annoying. And that means all your staff are going to find it pretty annoying. And it's going to be difficult to ensure that people keep it on for long periods of time when they have contact with others. And so saying a mask is going to do everything is probably a bit fanciful. And so you need to really bear in mind the efficacy of some of these measures. Testing is one that might be, if you can do it regularly, quite effective in ensuring that someone's not coming on with COVID, but that only works if you're doing it daily or every second day or so. And so these are the things you need to weigh up, is how effective are each of these different measures. And the final one I'll explain before we move on is we are seeing some big employers move to their own contact tracing. So that is, they are either obtaining RFID type chips or other Bluetooth type chips that can give them an indication of the extent to which staff are coming into contact with each other. Now that's so as to ensure that when there is a positive case, they can ensure business continuity and ensure they know who to extract from the workplace. And so just because the QR codes are ceasing from the government requirements, that doesn't mean, particularly for the bigger employers, there is an ability for you to take some of this on your own. And I certainly do know some of our clients that are actually putting in place their own tracing regimes to improve the ability to follow where the virus is circulating in their business. And all of these things need to be in your melting pot when we come to what are you going to do.
After 1 December in particular.
Yes.
Yeah. We might crack on a little bit. I just made a point before about making sure you're consulting. I honestly think that the next 6 to 8 weeks are going to be a fairly unusual and challenging period for business. I think that there will be a lot of learning on the run. I won't be shocked if the government, particularly New South Wales and probably then later on in Victoria, sort of shift and tilt some of their policy settings as we go. It's probably a time more than ever to be engaging with your staff around all of these issues. It's also probably a good time to be engaging with contractors, clients, or, as we said here, even landlords. So just be mindful that I think there's a sense of, over the next few weeks, it's just going to be all easy. Sadly, I think the next 8 to 10 weeks are probably going to be harder than we've probably seen as we come out and try and work out what is best for a particular business in its particular circumstances. So instead of just broad brush public health order requirements, we're going to be back to a lot of case by case. What are your particular circumstances and facts of where you run your business and the environment you operate in? So just be mindful that we're moving back into that world.
And just remember that for many of you with industrial instruments that apply, whether it's awards or enterprise agreements, you have consultation obligations in there for major workplace changes that have significant effects on employees. And under the WHS Act, you must consult on the measures that you introduce to mitigate risk. And so to the extent you're going to put any risk mitigation measures in, there's a positive obligation to consult under the WHS Act. So check your legal requirements, whether they're WHS Act or industrial instrument based, because you do have obligations there.
Vaccinations, Lewis.
Yes.
Topic. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to Lewis has spent a bit of time reading up about the science of vaccinations. Sadly, I spent a lot of time in the last month reading about neurology, but we won't go there for a while. As we sit here today, I think this might be a reasonable summary. I'll see if Lewis is going to agree with me. He might not. There is no clear single study that tells us that being vaccinated in any material sense stops the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the underlying virus. However, it's clearly the case now, scientifically proven, that if you are vaccinated, your chances of contracting COVID-19 if you carry the virus are diminished, and the likelihood of you developing COVID-19 as a severe case or for a lengthy period of time is greatly diminished. There is also a third proposition which is evolving out there, Lou, which is a number of primary policy players, the CDC, Otago, are adopting what we might describe as a force of logic position that there must be some broader community benefit dampening transmission of the virus the more people who are vaccinated, not necessarily based on a specific scientific study, but based on what might be said, the force of logic that's developing. Are you going to agree with me or disagree with me?
I think I think that broadly summarises the scenario as we currently face it. And I'll pick two of those points up particularly. Indeed, there are studies coming out that say vaccinated persons who test positive themselves in fact, have been shown to transmit it at roughly the same rate as unvaccinated persons and have been shown to have a similar viral load in their nose of the virus. But this force of logic point is this. The CDC and ATAGI and the federal government and the state governments have all said in various ways that vaccination will reduce transmission. And the logic that they are applying appears to be twofold. Firstly, if vaccinated people are less likely to contract COVID, they're less likely to get the symptomatic disease, then they are less likely to pass it on. And there are no studies yet, as you know, pertaining to vaccinated persons who may never have contracted the disease, whether they've passed it on or not. But that is the first logical principle. And the second is, even if they do contract the disease, they're likely to have it for a shorter period. So that's the scenario we're in. Certainly the Doherty Institute modelling that the federal government's relied on, and a number of the main public health authorities are telling us vaccination will reduce a level of transmission in a broad theoretical sense. But if push came to shove, if this is tested in a court, do we have the scientific study yet? I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah. So it's useful as a development for an employer who might want to mandate vaccination, say after the 1st of December or now. It's not necessarily scientifically conclusive that mandating vaccinations in and of itself is going to stop the spread. So it's a bit of it's a good development, but we're not quite to the scientific position that I think a lot of employers would probably appreciate.
I think that's right. And I think the unfortunate thing is we will get there eventually in terms of having data, but whether that's 6 months away, 12 months away, I don't know.
And it kind of brings us to what I call the big question, and we might have a chat about that. Obviously, a lot of employers are considering, do I mandate vaccination status for customers? No, you can't enter my shop unless you're vaccinated. And I'm presuming they're going to maintain that forever and a day. The same question is being asked about employees. So primarily thinking now about what you do after the 1st of December in your workplace or in your business. At the moment, to be frank, we're probably seeing 3 categories of businesses, of employers out there, and they sometimes cross over a little bit. We're seeing a number of employers who've obviously made risk-based assessments in terms of potential parts of their business having a mandatory vaccination policy. So childcare is probably a bad example because obviously certain public health orders or directions have effectively mandated vaccinations for those. But certainly we're seeing a number of businesses where there's very high community contact, are probably making risk assessments for certain people in their business definitely to be vaccinated. We've got a number of people who have sort of taken the approach of, well, I'm doing it anyway, and we'll see how that gets sorted out if I sack somebody because they're not vaccinated. And then we've got probably a large part of our client base who are sort of going, well, I'm going to probably watch what happens in November. I might watch what happens in early December. I'll get a feel for that. If I need to ultimately move to consider mandating vaccinations, be it for employers or customers, I'm probably going to become a fast follower than a leader. And Lou, they're probably the 3 categories of people we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I'd agree with that. I think there's a big distinction between customers and employees as well. And I think...
Should we deal with customers first?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Let's deal with customers first.
The short position with customers is you have a much broader and freer reign. And the reality is, as an occupier or owner of a premises, it is your right to determine who enters that premises and who does not. As the provider of a service, it is your right to decide who you provide that service to and who you do not. And if you wish to impose limits on who you serve or who you allow to enter, you are able to do that subject to one main qualification. And that qualification is the operation of anti-discrimination laws. Anti-discrimination laws prohibit people providing a service from discriminating in the provision of that service based on particular protected attributes: race, gender, national or ethnic origin, religion. And what we're going to see is that those grounds are largely not going to be relevant when it comes to letting someone onto your site who is or isn't vaccinated, except for perhaps 2 categories, and that is people who have a disability of some kind who cannot be vaccinated. There is who falls into that category, then as a business, provided they can substantiate the relevant medical condition, much like the public health orders require today, then you may find yourself in some trouble if you don't let someone on who's suffering from a particular kind of illness or injury that means they cannot be vaccinated. Now, I have to say the number of people in that category are going to be very, very low. You need to remember most people who are immunocompromised or who have some kind of disease are being encouraged to be vaccinated. They're at the front of the queue. So it's really only going to be certain particular classes of people, particularly with higher levels of allergies or something like that, that have a clear medical basis to indicate that they are at material risk if they become vaccinated. So that's one category. Religious belief has been raised in pockets. We haven't seen a lot of it yet.
We haven't really seen it though, have we, Lou, to be honest?
Not really. So, it's possible that there might be some religious doctrine that is referred to at some point in time, and maybe that might require revision on a case-by-case basis. But if you put those two categories to one side, other than that, you can choose who comes on and who does not. And if you choose to say that people who are not vaccinated cannot enter my premises, that is a requirement you are lawfully able to impose.
And I have to say, Lou, that I'm thinking of the businesses that I've been speaking to in the last 3 or 4 weeks. This appears to be more than I'm making a decision to do this. I see a lot of businesses almost seeing this as a way of advertising a benefit of coming to their establishment. So I talked to a dance studio, by way of example, a couple of days ago, and they said, well, we're going to make it clear that in terms of our adult dance studio, everybody has to be vaccinated if they want to come to the dance studio 1 December on. So you've got quite a few people at the moment who are seeing this as possibly a sort of a catch for customers to feel more comfortable to come in. And I imagine you'll start to see a lot of signs for 1 December on in particular, which says only vaccinated customers allowed, and the idea being more people might come and shop in my shop if that's the case. So I think this will become a real issue. I just suspect most people will just accept that from time to time there might be a small hiccup with a particular class of customer, and they'll deal with that on the run.
Yep.
Let's turn to the more contentious group. Your favourite group, employees. We constantly forget about the new employee issue. We said to clients a year ago, start thinking about changing your employment contracts so that you can require people to be vaccinated. I know, ironically, most people a year ago said, oh, this will all be over, we don't need to do that. I suspect they might be thinking about it now, but, there's no doubt that you could actually rewrite an employment contract for new employees, or if you do actually have a process whereby you might recontract somebody with a pay increase, there's no doubt that you could actually deal with this in the contract, Lewis. You could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. As long as you've got an express term in the contract, then that governs the relationship between you. And again, it would only be if someone cannot comply because of an attribute protected by discrimination laws, think disability, think religion, that there might be some ability to refuse. So for new employees, the scenario is quite simple if you want to include that requirement in your contract. We've included drafting now in a number of clients' contracts over the past couple of weeks to this effect, and certainly reach out if you'd like us to assist with that because we have the drafting ready to go. Existing employees is where the debate is. In relation to existing employees, because no one saw the pandemic coming, I certainly didn't, no one really has provisions in their contracts dealing with a requirement to be vaccinated or to otherwise undergo some procedure that would be captured or that would capture vaccination. And so what employers will need to rely upon if they're going to impose some new requirement on the performance of work is the ability to issue a direction that is reasonable and lawful. And it's not going to be unlawful, so I kind of kick that to one side. The question here is really, is it reasonable for an employer to direct an employee to become vaccinated to perform a particular form of work? And that's where the debate is going to lie.
And there's no doubt, Lewis, that as we sit here today, and again, we do say that time might shift the sands of this a little bit, but as we sit here today, that's really a sort of business by business, industry by industry consideration. So putting public health orders aside, public health directions aside, it's almost self-evident that it's probably reasonable for that direction to be given if you're dealing with vulnerable people such as the aged or people with disabilities. It's almost self-evident that would be a reasonable and lawful direction if you're dealing with children who can't be vaccinated. So straight away, there's unashamedly certain categories where that sort of direction even today, if there was no public health orders, we would say straight away, not a problem with that. You then get to the other end of the spectrum where you might have, factory workers making chocolate bars. Well, that becomes a slightly different question.
Yeah, and I think, the childcare example is a good one because this is where the main case arises from. The main case on vaccination outside health orders involves Good Start Early Learning, and they mandated the imposition of a flu vaccine with no public health order behind it. And the Fair Work Commission said, well, if you look at what's happening here, you have vulnerable people who can't be vaccinated. There is no ability to distance or to practice any safe hygiene. They went into a bit of graphic detail. The workers are dealing with bodily fluids, feces. They're completely intertwined with the people that they are caring for, who have no ability to be controlled, who are disobedient. And in that circumstance, the reality is that this is a reasonable measure to take to protect the customers in that circumstance and the business as a whole. And so the Fair Work Commission said it was a lawful and reasonable direction to give. Now, you need to take that thinking and you need to transplant it into your own organisation. Are my members of my team, of my staff, are they dealing regularly with members of the public? Are they doing it in a circumstance that's somewhat uncontrolled? So a good example is someone who is working at a customer checkout. No matter how big the screen is you put in front of them, high level of interaction with the public, people who may talk to them beside or behind the screen. You can't work the EFTPOS machine particularly well because I don't know why, but all these EFTPOS machines seem to be faulty these days. So there must be some grand conspiracy theory that they're actually swiping out details or something. They used to work very well. They don't anymore. But I digress. The point is there's things that happen that are very difficult to control. And so in that circumstance, because of the variability, because of the lack of control, it may be to prevent transmission in the workplace to the customer and also to your own employees. You say, I'm not comfortable with the existing controls available to me. I don't think I can distance very well. I don't think masks are a good long-term solution. And all of a sudden you're coming to, well, maybe vaccination is a control that's reasonable in this circumstance. And so that's where we're looking at scenarios that you might have a better ability to impose a direction that people become mandated to work. The other key area Nigel's already referenced is where it's necessary to increase levels of business confidence. If you take the airlines that were the very fast movers here, they really need to convince people it's safe to get into the sky. And if
I get that. They need to convince people it's safe to get into a very confined space such as an aeroplane.
Yes, sorry, that's a better way of rephrasing it. And it's a very confined space. People are anxious about these type of travel. They need to do everything they can.
You're all breathing the same air. It's all recycled in the aeroplane.
They need to do everything they can to encourage people that it's safe. And so straight away, they're going to be mandating vaccination for customers and employees. And I think that's entirely defensible in that type of industry, or else the viability of the business is put at risk. And again, you get this thinking and you need to apply it over each different category of worker that you have. And the big unknown here, and it's not quite known yet, and so if you want to move quickly with mandating, is the role that testing is going to have to play. Because right now, PCR testing, the spike up the nostrils, is quite impractical because of the delay it takes to get a result. There's no point testing someone for COVID before allowing them onto the workplace if you only find out the next day that they were infected. As rapid antigen testing becomes more available and might become a bit cheaper, the question becomes, if you're really worried about the level of transmission, is rapid antigen testing a better control measure? Now, there's a few issues with that at the moment. One, it's still quite costly. Even at wholesale rates for really big businesses, the numbers I'm hearing, it could be $10, $15 a test.
I think the current average is about $27 a test.
So that's still quite high as a practicable measure. It comes up with false positives and false negatives. False positives will be less of a concern, but as long as you've got false negatives, that's a bit problematic. And there's a question about how long it takes, but I think the time taken to do it's coming down. But the big one at the moment is I think the Therapeutic Goods Administration is still requiring the rapid antigen testing to be done by either a healthcare practitioner or under their direct supervision. Now, as long as that is the framework, rapid antigen testing is probably not where it needs to be as a control that's particularly practicable. That might change in future. But I think that's the real space to watch, because if that becomes a better control, then the need and the really the reasonableness of vaccination might start to fall away. I don't think it's where we need it to be yet, though.
No, I agree. And I think the takeaway here is, look, some employers are going to mandate vaccinations without a lot of thought. I'm just going to do it. It's what I believe in almost. We've had some employers say that to us. It's the right thing to do by the community. Most of our clients at the moment are trying to work their way through this list with us to work out which parts of their business it might. And as we said right at the beginning, sort of keep your ear to the ground, because it might well be that we get much stronger scientific basis for supporting the notion of mandating vaccinations, i.e. they definitely, as a matter of scientific proof, stop the spread of the virus. All of a sudden, we have a much stronger position if we do want to mandate in a particular business. At the moment, it's an evaluative process, looking at, as Lewis said, different constituent parts of the business. Now, Lou, I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to use the next 3 minutes. You said something earlier which I'm personally struggling with, and the audience is struggling with, but it might simply be you've read the public health orders in New South Wales better than me. So here we go. Here we go. We'll have a look at this now. Gosh, I feel scared calling you out. I'm going to give an example. I'm going to give an answer, but then I'm going to come back to what you said, which is concerned some of the audience. My understanding is that in terms of, say, returning to the office before 1 December, you can only return to the office if you're vaccinated. Do you agree with that?
Unless it is not reasonably practicable for you to do your job from home.
Okay, and that arises, are you saying that arises from the public health order?
Yes.
Okay, so now it's really important that we clarify this, because I must be frank, I had missed that myself, Lou, and I think it startled the audience.
So bear with me. Now, obviously, the only exception to this, though, is those premises where you have to ensure that the unvaccinated people can't come on. So if we're talking about retail, if we're talking about hospitality, that's an exception, because the occupier of the premises must ensure that it does what it reasonably can to not allow anyone unvaccinated on. So that includes staff. So automatically there's
a blanket class. Tick that box. Outside of the blanket class.
Outside of the blanket class, I'm going to bring up.
I'm testing it live here. Look at this. We're testing it live.
I'm bringing it up. So bear with me. It'll only take a minute or two.
We've only got a minute or two.
No, that's all right. We can do this now on webcast, because, you know, we're not in a studio, but I've got my computer in front of me. It says, let me get quickly. One sec.
I was going to chat while you did that, but it might put you off.
I might not be able to find it quickly enough, but my understanding from reading it only very recently is that you must not allow unvaccinated persons onto the premises, into the workplace, unless it is not practicable for them to work from home.
Okay. Well, what we might do two things, because I think it's important issue. We'll put out an alert this week on this issue, just to clarify it for most people.
I found it.
You have?
I found it. I'll read it out.
Good
Working
idea.
from home. This is the order that will take effect on Monday. An employer must require an employee who is not a fully vaccinated person to work at the employee's place of residence unless it is not reasonably practicable to do so. And then it goes on to say, an employee who's not fully vaccinated must not work at a place other than their residence unless it is not reasonably practicable to work at the place of residence.
Okay, and I think the answer to this probably is that I think the last year has told us that for 99.9% of people, it is practicable to work at home unless you're a factory worker or something like that.
Well, that's a great example. A factory worker just can't work from home, and this would pick them up.
Okay, and this in a way is overcoming the LGA of concern issue. It's sort of, that's how we stepped over it.
Yes, because now, in effect, no one can go in to work unless vaccinated. So it's a bigger step, but they have that reasonably practical caveat, if you like, that allows work to occur where it just can't be done from home.
Okay, so the question of do I vaccinate or mandate vaccination or not might be a little bit more live come Monday for some classes of employer than others.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good. Lou, it's 1 minute past one. I said to you before we started we could probably spend an hour on this. I have been watching the questions as we've gone, and putting aside that last question which I raised with you, we've actually done a pretty decent job of actually responding to some of the questions in our dialogue as we've gone through. Thanks for staying with us today. I appreciate that it is a bit of a moving feast. We'll be looking to bring you a further webcast in due course, and certainly before the 1 December date. I suspect we'll be saying some of what we said today in that next webcast, but I wouldn't be shocked if we're saying some new stuff as well. Lou, thanks for joining me. Look forward to the haircut. Thanks for joining me.
Yes.
And please take care, everybody. And as always, we'll try and make sure that our next alert deals with some of the more specific questions we've been answered if we haven't been able to get hold of them today. And please, as I've said now for the last year and a half, please stay safe, and we'll see you shortly. Take care.